Hey guys, tonight we're stepping barefoot onto golden sand, where the wind hums with secrets and ancient whispers ride the heat. You squint into the sun, its glare bouncing off a horizon that seems to melt into itself. There's nothing but dunes ahead, shifting, sighing, swallowing everything in silence. But underneath that golden sea lies a story so improbable, so dusty, so utterly forgotten that you probably won't survive this history lesson with your ego intact. Yep, you're about to discover that the Sahara once hid a metropolis of scholars who debated theology over tea and copied entire libraries by hand while Europe, at the time, was still figuring out how not to eat soup with its fingers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trudging through a desert that could char your soul through the soles of your shoes. The sand sticks to everything: your skin, your eyelashes, the inside of your ears somehow. There's no water for miles, and even your camel looks like he regrets signing up for this journey. But it's not just a desert. It's the Saharan ancient ocean of dunes that swallowed cities, armies, and at least one explorer who brought 17 crates of brandy and 0 maps. In the golden light, you notice something strange. The wind isn't just whispering, it's speaking. And what it's saying is old. Older than the parchment tucked under a merchant's arm. Older than the legends about Alexander the Great founding cities here. He didn't, by the way. Historians still argue whether he even knew where West Africa was. This isn't just sand. It's memory, ground into grains. And somewhere in this sea of memory, you feel the pull of a name: Timbuktu. Not just a metaphor for somewhere really far away, but a real place once, a thriving hub of knowledge, trade, and dusty scrolls. You adjust your scarf and press forward, sunsick and slightly giddy, as if you've crossed into another time. By the 13th century, this region isn't empty, it's booming. You pass caravans carrying salt slabs the size of coffins, balanced precariously on camels that snort like they're over it. Traders swap gossip, jokes, and recipes while campfires flicker under starlight. You smell cumin, sweat, and something suspiciously like goat stew. These caravans stretch for miles. Commerce, conversation, and cultural exchange rolling slowly across the dunes. Then you hear the clink of gold. Mali, the empire you're now sauntering through, is drenched in it, like Mansa Musa's, that guy rich. You might have heard the legend of his pilgrimage to Mecca, where he handed out so much gold that it wrecked Cairo's economy. Oops. But here's the part they don't teach you in school. He wasn't just hoarding wealth, he was funding knowledge. The gold wasn't for palimpsest, was for libraries. As the sun begins to lower mercifully, you crest a dune, and there it is, a city rising from the sand, but not in some hazy mirage way. This is real. Mud brick minarets stand proud, their ridged surfaces catching the light like ancient zippers. Rooftops made of palm logs and packed earth shimmer, and the air smells not just of dust, but of ink. Timbuktu. Its name feels like a spell. Say it once, and you're a traveler. Say it twice, and you're a seeker of forgotten wisdom. Say it 3 times, and well, don't. We're trying to sleep here. You walk past the outer walls, which are surprisingly low. Timbuktu wasn't built for war, but for thought. Markets crowd the streets. Women with silver bangles sell dates and dried fish. Kids chase goats with alarming energy. And elders sip mint tea like it's their life's purpose. Somewhere, a man sings a praise poem to the rhythm of a stringed ngoni. It sounds like a lullaby for the ancestors. The air shifts. You feel it before you see Iton energy humming beneath your feet. You're standing above layers of manuscript tunnels and sunken libraries hidden behind homes, buried beneath courtyards. This place wasn't just about trade. It was a library in disguise, a bookshelf disguised as a town, and you're walking on centuries of ink. Oh, and about that ink, it wasn't your basic black. Timbuktu's scribes used indigo from the Nile, ochre from the cliffs of Bandiagra, crushed hibiscus for red, and powdered fish scales for a kind of silver shimmer. Some manuscripts even used ink mixed with crocodile dung, because apparently the ancient world had a sense of humor and a strong stomach. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's scholars were working from classical Greek sources or building entirely African frameworks of knowledge. The truth is probably both, but when your textbooks erase entire civilizations, you don't get a tidy answer. You get mystery, and maybe a little righteous indignation. It's getting darker now. A soft blue twilight wraps around the mud brick walls like a shawl. Lamps flicker to life, casting long shadows that seem to stretch from the past. You hear the echo of chanting students reciting lines from memory, testing their tongues against the rhythms of logic and law. You sit for a moment on a rooftop. The wind brushes past you, warm and tired. You feel it again, that pull. This place isn't just about what it was. It's about what it remembers. About all the books you'll never see, tucked under floorboards, hidden from colonizers, preserved by sheer will and salt air. Tomorrow you'll explore the city. You'll step into its legendary university, meet the scribes, flip through the brittle pages of astronomy and gossip and sorcery. But for now, just sit. Let the sand hum its lullaby. Let Timbuktu rise around you, not as a ghost but as a whisper you're lucky enough to hear. The sun blinks over the horizon like it too is a little stunned by what you're seeing. From your rooftop perch, you finally step down carefully, because these ladders are more suggestion than structure, and head toward the heart of the city. The air smells of morning bread and old parchment, which is honestly a top 5-cent combo if you're into that sort of thing. Timbuktu wakes early. It has to. This is a city that breathes knowledge before breakfast. You pass narrow alleys crowded with scholars in flowing white bubas, their voices weaving in and out of debate, even as they dodge goats and toddlers. Everyone's multitasking, carrying a jug of water in one hand and a scroll in the other, discussing divine unity while checking the ripeness of a mango. And then, without ceremony, you arrive. The crown jewel. The reason you crossed a desert with sand in unspeakable places. Sankore. It doesn't hit you with grandeur. Not like a palace, not like a Gothic cathedral, not even like Hogwarts. Sorry. It's modest, built from sun-baked mud, wooden beams jutting out like ribs, the courtyard shaded with fabric slung between date palms. But there's something about it. Maybe it's the way the light falls through the latticed windows, dust dancing in golden shafts. Maybe it's the quiet reverence in the air, like the building knows what it holds. It doesn't hit you with grandeur, not like a palace, not like a Gothic cathedral, not even like Hogwarts. Sorry. It's modest, built from sun-baked mud, wooden beams jutting out like ribs, the courtyard shaded with fabric slung between date palms. But there's something about it. Maybe it's the way the light falls through the latticed windows, dust dancing in golden shafts. Maybe it's the quiet reverence in the air, like the building knows what it holds. Because Sankore isn't just a mosque, it's a university, one of the world's oldest. While Oxford was still squinting at Latin and the University of Paris was debating how many angels could fit on a pin, Sankore was training jurists, theologians, doctors, poets, and astronomers under the African sun. And the students? They didn't just stroll in. You had to qualify, recite the Quran, demonstrate literacy, and yes, pass the medieval equivalent of a very, very intense oral exam. And these weren't undergrads slacking off between naps. These were lifelong scholars, many of whom memorized hundreds of texts, could cite obscure law by heart, and wrote entire treatises on logic before lunch, which, by the way, was often millet stew eaten with your hands and a little side of astronomy. You're invited into a class lucky you, and you sit cross-legged on the floor. The room is cool and shadowy, the walls thick enough to keep the heat out and the wisdom in. The teacher, an elder with a voice like slow thunder, holds a palm leaf pointer and walks slowly through rows of students. No chalkboards here, just ink, memory, and repetition. He's reading from a text on Islamic jurisprudence, but next door they're studying the movement of the stars, and just down the hall someone's defending a thesis on the ethical treatment of camels. Not a joke. There are rules. What's wild is that these scholars weren't just importing knowledge, they were generating it. Timbuktu's golden age wasn't about parroting back Greek philosophy or borrowing from Arabic texts. It was about remixing, reinterpreting, and localizing knowledge for a very specific cultural moment. Think of it like a medieval mashup. Yes, they quoted Aristotle, but they also debated him. And sometimes they dunked on him. One fringe manuscript you see half buried beneath a stack of legal commentary contains a weird little drawing of the solar system. It has a central sun, not Earth, pre-Copernican. Historians still argue whether it's legit science or a poetic metaphor, but you raise your eyebrows and casually mouth "what the," while pretending you're totally calm. Another student pulls you aside. He's been working on a commentary on medical herbs used in West African villages. The text is worn, but still legible. Baobab for inflammation, hibiscus for fever, shea for skin ailments. You're nodding along until he casually mentions a potion that cools the blood of angry men. Honestly, sounds like something we could use in modern politics. The most surreal part? This is all happening while the rest of the world, at least the parts that usually get the spotlight, were floundering. Europe, post-Rome, was knee-deep in feudal squabbles and bubonic unpleasantness. Timbuktu, on the other hand, had academic tenure, robust peer review, complete with calligraphy, and a strong stance against plagiarism. One scholar, Ahmad Baba, was famous for publicly scolding students who copied without attribution. Kind of the medieval West African version of a copyright lawyer, but with more grace and better metaphors. It wasn't all serious, though. You see a sidebar in a law book that appears to be a limerick about a corrupt judge. Another text hides a tiny doodle of a donkey wearing spectacles. Even in the hallowed halls of Sankore, someone had time for jokes. You exit through the rear courtyard, your brain buzzing with knowledge, dust, and a mild academic inferiority complex. Outside, two teenage students are arguing over the pronunciation of a Persian loanword while practicing astronomy with a wooden quadrant. Another group chants verses from a poet named Al-Saadi, whose rhymes are so tight they could have been battle raps if Timbuktu had a stage. It's here, on the shaded steps of Sankore, that you realize you're standing in the ruins of something great. Not ruined in the physical sense, though. Time hasn't been kind, but in the memory sense. In the way history books skim over this place, or treat it like a footnote. This was a city of thinkers, where a scholar could earn more social clout than a warrior. A town where being a bookworm wasn't just respectable, was a fast track to influence. You sit on the steps as the evening wind picks up, flipping the edge of a stray parchment. It's handwritten, speckled with sand, and still faintly fragrant with whatever they used to cure the leather. You squint and read the first line. It's a proverb. A word written lasts longer than the man who speaks it. Yeah, you feel that one in your bones. By now, The scent of manuscript ink is pretty much embedded in your nostril sequel parts mystery and mildew. But don't worry, you'll get used to it. You follow a narrow alley that snakes between sun-baked walls, stepping over sleepy cats, discarded sandals, and a few broken quills. You're headed toward the market district, not for fruit or fabric, but for something far more valuable in Timbuktu's golden age, salt and scrolls. Yep, salt. The white gold of the desert. You round a corner and nearly collide with a caravan driver yelling something urgent about a misplaced camel and a shipment of salt bricks from Tagaza. These bricks aren't tiny shaker-sized cubes, they're half your height and weigh more than a mildly grumpy ostrich. Salt was so valuable here it could be traded ounce for ounce with gold. You try not to look shocked when someone slaps a price tag on a chunk of sodium chloride like it's a Rolex. You duck under a faded awning, following the shade into the marketplace. It's packed lively, loud, and vibrating with life. Traders in turbans haggle over everything from spices to ivory to cloth, dyed the deepest indigo you've ever seen. But off to the side, tucked behind baskets of dates and a guy selling what might be honey or might be suspiciously thick motor oil, you spot the real prize, a manuscript vendor. He's got scrolls, folios, and bound texts stacked like pancakes. The pages shimmer faintly with age and dust. This isn't a bookshop, it's a memory bazaar. And this man, he's not just a seller. He's a librarian, philosopher, possibly a gossip, and definitely a gatekeeper of ancient tea. You crouch beside his stall. He waves a fly away from a leather-bound manuscript and grins. "This one," he says, tapping a bundle with a cracked red ribbon, "was copied by a blind scribe who never made a mistake." You blink. That's probably exaggeration, but also, maybe not. In Timbuktu, scribes were legends, trained for years. Many could write for hours without looking, chanting verses as they inked lines with astonishing precision. Their pens were carved from reeds, their inks brewed from natural diced pomegranate for red, soot and acacia gum for black, turmeric for gold accents. And their work, it wasn't just scripture or law. They copied poetry, astrology, linguistics, medicine, even dream interpretation manuals, because why shouldn't you monetize insomnia? You gently unroll one scroll and scan the delicate Arabic script. The words snake across the page in steady musical lines. The subject? A treatise on trade routes, camel hygiene, and how to prevent your salt cargo from absorbing jealous energies. You raise an eyebrow, and the vendor just shrugs. "Desert spirits don't like greedy traders," he whispers. "Noted." You keep browsing. There's a manuscript on the history of the Songhai Empire, one on court etiquette, including how not to spill tea in front of a sultan, and another on celestial navigation that contains a hand-drawn star chart dated to a lunar eclipse in 1282. Some of these texts are scientific marvels. Others are delightfully weird. One slim volume appears to be an etiquette guide for talking to cats. Fringe? Absolutely. Adorable? Also yes. But not all the texts are for sale. Some are heirloom sacred, hidden, only shown to trusted eyes. The vendor nods toward a locked chest. Those stay, he says. Family manuscripts. My grandfather buried them in the wall during the Moroccan invasion. You pause. That invasion, it's a shadow over the city's golden age. Back in the late 1500s, Moroccan forces lured by tales of gold and Timbuktu's reputation stormed across the desert. They brought guns, burned archives, exiled scholars, and shattered the city's academic backbone. Some libraries were looted, their books hauled across the Sahara or lost to sand and fire. Others were hidden, buried beneath homes, sewn into thatched ceilings, or smuggled out in the folds of a merchant's robe. In response, Timbuktu didn't fight back with swords, it resisted with secrecy. 1,000 tiny rebellions of preservation. And here you are, centuries later, fingering the corners of that history. The sun's higher now. The heat folds over the city like a heavy curtain. You seek shade beneath a canopy of woven reeds and sip a lukewarm brew of hibiscus tea someone offers you. Around you, old men are debating a tax ruling from the 14th century like it happened last week. One of them jabs the air with a calligraphy brush for emphasis. What strikes you isn't just how much they know, it's how much they remember. This was a society that prioritized learning across generations. Fathers taught sons, mothers whispered to daughters, elders passed down stories like braided threads. Paper might fade, but oral memory held the ink when pages couldn't. And they weren't just hoarding knowledge, they were trading it. Caravans brought not just salt and gold, but books. Texts from Egypt, Morocco, Andalusia, and even the Indian subcontinent arrived here, copied by hand and discussed under stars. This was the Silk Road of the mind, a knowledge superhighway made of dusty sandals and whispered metaphors. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's intellectual network was centralized or more like a bunch of independent scholars doing their own thing with occasional meetups and tea. Either way, the result was a remarkable accumulation of thought, some of it profound, some of it hilariously mundane, all of it human. You stand now at the edge of the market square, where the scent of cinnamon and old paper swirls in the air like a forgotten spell. Behind you, the manuscript vendor calls out to another traveler. Ahead, the minaret of Jingwereber Mosque peaks above the rooftops, watching the city like an ancient librarian who never blinks. Your fingers are still smudged with ink. You didn't expect this much magic from a mud brick town the world tried to forget. But Timbuktu remembers. You stretch your legs and wander, your feet kicking up little flurries of ochre-colored dust as you head toward a place whispered about in every corner of the city. Not a palace, not a market, not even a shrine. You're going to a classroom. And not just any classroom. You're walking into the beating heart of learning, the University of Sankore, again, but deeper now. Past the mosque's great prayer halls and bustling courtyards, you're led to a quiet inner room. The temperature drops a degree or two. The air here smells like sandalwood, parchment, and somehow curiosity. You sit cross-legged on a woven mat that's probably older than your country in weight. Students trickle in, teenagers, graybeards, wide-eyed novices, and well-read master siege carrying bundles of parchment, reed pens, and expressions so focused they could set fire to the walls with their gaze. Then the teacher arrives. He's old, really old, like beard so white it's seen empires fall old, but his eyes, sparkling mischief. He taps his wooden staff once on the stone floor and the room goes still. Today, he says, we study the stars. You're expecting something gentle, a little constellation talk, maybe some folklore about Orion's belt. Nope. This man launches straight into astronomy specifically, planetary orbits, and lunar visibility calculations. Someone in the back mutters something about Ibn al-Shatir's correction of Ptolemaic models. And the professor, he beams. Yes, yes, he says. And before Copernicus, if you're paying attention, you blink. Did he just suggest that West African scholars were ahead of Europe on heliocentric models? Well, yes, sort of. Historians still argue whether these models were precise, symbolic, or just poetic. But what's clear is that Timbuktu's scholars weren't just observers, they were thinkers. They took Greek, Roman, Arabic, Berber, and local astronomical traditions and mashed them up into celestial fusion cuisine. Some charts even hinted at elliptical orbits. Elliptical. In the 1400s, before the telescope. Just let that sink in while you chew your metaphorical desert granola bar. But astronomy was just the appetizer. The lesson moves on. You flip open a student's notebook and skim lines written in exquisite Arabic. It's a dense tangle of legal references, ethical arguments, and something that might be a poem about trade taxes. The student shrugs. Law class. Of course it is. You glance at the bookshelf, well, more like a book pile, and your jaw drops. Manuscripts everywhere, bound in leather, tied in strips of dyed camel hide, stacked like sleepy pancakes. Titles include Treatise on Human Behavior in Desert Trade Disputes, The Nature of Soul and Sand, On the Legal Status of Floating Goats, Don't Ask, Principles of Measurement in Shadow-Based Timekeeping. You whisper, "Are these real?" The student nods casually. "We copy them ourselves for practice." You feel about as scholarly as a soup spoon in a chess game. Here's the thing. This wasn't learning for status. This was learning as worship, as resistance, as breath. You study not because you have to, but because forgetting is a kind of death. That's why the classrooms had no desks, no textbooks, no PowerPoint slides. They had teachers walking library sand students who spent their whole lives memorizing, questioning, debating, and preserving. Oral tradition intertwined with written record, the past braided into the present. One of the fringe facts you pick up from a passing conversation: the color of a student's head wrap sometimes denoted their field of study. Blue for law, green for medicine, red for poetry. Was it formal? Maybe. Was it fashion? Almost definitely. And we love a scholarly dress code. Later, the class shifts topics again to ethics. You're not ready. The question up for debate: is it moral to sell water during a drought if the buyer is desperate? Suddenly, the room explodes into gentle chaos. Hands fly up, voices raise, then soften. One older student cites a 14th century jurist from Gao. Another invokes Al-Ghazali. A young woman brings up the morality of withholding knowledge. It's not just Lowit's life. You don't notice the hours passing. The heat outside has softened into that golden late afternoon glow that makes everything feel like an old postcard. The class breaks, and students head to the mosque for prayer, or out into the courtyard to argue over footnotes and metaphysics. You stay behind. One of the older scholars approaches you with a grin. "You're still sitting here," he says. You nod, just taking it in. He gestures to the manuscripts around you. Most of these, he says, were copied by hands long dead, and still they speak. You swallow hard, because that's it. That's the pulse of this place. This was a city that heard its ancestors, where knowledge wasn't just read, it was remembered, respoken, recopied, lived again. And it wasn't all high-minded philosophy either. One nearby scholar chuckles as he reads a line from a student's copybook. "My goat ate the ink, but not the meaning." You leave the classroom with your sandals full of dust, your mind full of stars, and your heart a little cracked open. Somewhere nearby, the call to prayer echoes softly. Timbuktu doesn't teach in whispers. It sings. You rise before dawn, this time woken not by roosters or prayer calls, but by a rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch outside your window. At first, you think it's a sandstorm tap dancing across the roof. But as you peek through the slats, you see the unmistakable hunched shape of a man in a linen robe, bent over a wooden bench, lit by a single oil lamp. He's not battling a storm, he's copying words. A scribe. It's one thing to read about them, another to see them in action. You creep down, barefoot, and mostly invisible in the early gloom, and settle beside him on the stone ledge. He doesn't look up. His fingers are stained with ink, his lips moving faintly, chanting the words as he writes. The page is thin, fibrous, possibly made from old cotton flutter, slightly in the breeze, as if even the air respects the script. The sun hasn't even cleared the minaret yet, and already this man has written more than most people tweet in a week. His tools are humble: a reed cut to a fine point, a small jar of black ink, the consistency of molasses, and a wooden board for steadiness. But in this quiet hour, it might as well be a printing press. You glance at the page. It's not a religious text, but a commentary on astronomy. Every word perfectly aligned, letters slanted with just the right tilt, spacing tight but not cramped. The script isn't just legible, it's beautiful. Timbuktu's scribes weren't just secretaries, they were artisans, trained to translate thought into tangible, elegant permanence. Their calligraphy styles varied by family, region, and mood. One style swirled like vine leaves. Another, your personal favorite, looked like waves crashing gently across the page. And the ink? Oh, the ink was a recipe in itself. You hear the man whisper as he mixes more. Gum Arabic for smoothness, charcoal for darkness, a drop of lemon juice to keep the spirits clean. Wait, what? Yes, apparently there was a widely held belief, half superstition, half safety net, that the ink's composition could protect the writer's thoughts from jealousy or misinterpretation. Some scribes added saffron, crushed date pits, or even crocodile dung, supposedly to ward off confusion. Historians still argue whether this was ritual magic, microbial knowledge, or just ancient peer pressure. But when the ink glows slightly in the light, you don't question it. You just believe a little. The scribe pauses and finally acknowledges you. Want to try? He asks. You blink. Write in a centuries-old manuscript with a quill that might be older than your dental work? No pressure. He hands you a test scrap. You dip the pen too much ink hand. Your first letter looks like a startled toad. He chuckles but says nothing. You adjust, slow down, breathe with each stroke. The reed glides. You're writing not just scribbling, but forming deliberate, careful characters. It's like your heartbeat joins the rhythm. You look over and see his own pages stacked neatly, each page topped with a tiny cloth bag filled with sand to weigh it down while it dries. The sand is white and fine, not the same as the Sahara stuff. Desert won't do, he mutters. Too coarse. You want river sand, gentle sand. Of course you do. The morning deepens. Around you, other scribes begin to stir. They appear in doorways, courtyard corners, shady stoops. It's like watching monks emerge from hibernation, ink pots in hand, stretching fingers already stained with knowledge. Some are young, no older than high schoolers. Others could probably write in 3 languages blindfolded with a goat chewing on their robe. One woman works from her lap, effortlessly copying verses from a theological debate while bouncing a sleepy toddler on her knee. You don't stare. You just sit and absorb. It's humbling. It's a little hypnotizing. It's also really dusty. You strike up a conversation with an apprentice named Bashir, who's been training for 4 years and has only just been allowed to copy primary manuscripts instead of practice texts. He pulls out a notebook and shows you examples of his early work-wobbly lines, inky smudges, little doodles of camels in the margins. You laugh. So does he. Writing is patience, he says. You have to know the meaning before you copy the word. That line hits you harder than it should. He also mentions that some scribes write in code when working on private family text-altered alphabets, false starts, mirrored characters, and even hidden jokes. You blink. So, basically, ancient manuscript cryptography, like a medieval Da Vinci Code but with more sand and less melodrama. You spot one scribe writing with purple ink and ask if that's common. No, he says. This is for a wedding contract. Oh, of course it is. Apparently, different colored inks were used for different purposes. Black for law, red for headings and emphasis, blue or purple for poetry, and green for special religious commentary. There are entire texts written in alternating colors, designed to be read aloud with musical intonation. Yes, sung. Timbuktu didn't just read books. Sometimes it performed them. And it wasn't just what they wrote, it was where. Some scribes worked in libraries, others in homes, and a few even carved out tiny rooms in the back of mosques or market stalls. They wrote between goat deliveries, under trees, during sandstorms. Manuscript culture here wasn't hidden. It was woven into daily life. You visit one such house library. It looks like a regular home from the front, but once inside, you're shown a staircase that leads into a cool shaded room lined with shelves. The manuscripts are wrapped in cloth, tied with cords, stacked in silent anticipation. The owner is the great-granddaughter of a scholar. She unwraps one folio and reveals a book of proverbs, some as old as the house itself. One reads, "Ink lasts longer than blood." Another, "A dull pen is sharper than a fast tongue." You leave the house blinking in the sunlight, your fingers still tingling with the memory of that scribe's ink. Around you, the city buzzes with life-again bakers setting up shop, kids chasing chickens, scholars walking with scrolls under their arms like it's just another Tuesday. But you know better now. In Timbuktu, every Tuesday is sacred. By now, your nose can sniff out parchment in a sandstorm, and your ears have grown tuned to the soft flick of manuscript pages turning somewhere nearby. But you're not just wandering through legal texts and philosophical debates anymore. You're headed for the good stuff, the weird, wonderful, and occasionally what on earth is that side of Timbuktu's manuscript culture. You're about to enter a private family library, one of hundreds scattered across the city. No official sign, just a heavy wooden door and a quiet knock. The family inside has been keeping these texts hidden for generations. Not in a museum, not in an archive. In a bedroom closet lined with goat skin and wrapped in layers of faded indigo cloth. Cozy. The eldest son leads you in. He's maybe 22, barefoot, and already sounds like a medieval scholar who's seen some things. He unrolls a scroll, lays it carefully on the table, and says, "This one's about marriage and planetary influence." You blink. What now? Turns out, in Timbuktu, manuscripts weren't just about theology or politics. You find pages on medicine, arithmetic, farming calendars, grammar, dream interpretation, and marriage advice based on astrological signs. Because apparently, 15th century Mali was ready to swipe left on your Saturn placement if it clashed with their goat herder moon. The scroll he shows you is meticulously written, with headings in red ink and tiny notes scrawled in the margins. Avoid union under Mars, and best days for betrothal when the moon is waxing and millet is plentiful. You smile. Some things never change. Everyone wants love, a good harvest, and maybe fewer in-laws on eclipse days. You move on to another manuscript, this one on medicine. But it's not just a list of herbs, it's poetic. One entry reads, "To cool the fire in the belly, steep the leaf that looks like sorrow and smells like morning." You ask the young librarian what that means. He shrugs. Could be mint, could be something only my grandmother knows. And just like that, you're reminded that books aren't the whole story here people are. Historians still argue whether these texts represent scientific knowledge or symbolic expression, whether a recipe for water that sings is a medicinal tonic or a metaphor for calming prayers. Either way, the manuscripts blur the line between fact and feeling. You flip through another book, this one about omens, not astrology exactly, more like a user's manual for reading the world. If a lizard crosses your path before sunset, good luck. If your goat sneezes twice while facing west, maybe stay home today. Some pages even include dream interpretation, like, to dream of sand in your teeth means lies are near your ears. You grin. It's like ancient West African BuzzFeed quizzes. There are even collections of love letters, handwritten exchanges preserved like pressed flowers. One says, "I have seen your footsteps in the dust, and I long to follow them, even if they lead me to where salt forgets the sea." Okay, who gave Timbuktu permission to be this romantic? You pause at a peculiar volumea stitched together booklet with worn edges and a faint smell of cloves. This one isn't labeled. The script is messier, older, as if written in a hurry. You can barely make out the title, Spells for Reversal and Returning. Oh boy, inside, you find short verses and diagrams of mysterious symbols, some resembling early alchemical charts, others just unsettling. One page describes how to bind a lie to silence using ash, ink, and a drop of morning sweat. Another references calling back the lost voice from the wind. Fringe material, sure, but it's not treated like nonsense here. It's cataloged, stored alongside legal texts and moral treatises. In Timbuktu, knowledge wasn't just what could be proved. It was what could be recorded. If someone thought it mattered, it mattered. The idea that only verified, peer-reviewed facts count as knowledge, that's a modern idea. Timbuktu's scribes took a broader view. They wrote about dreams, rituals, illnesses, prophecies, and personal philosophy with equal reverence. This wasn't science versus magicite, was coexistence. You got your medical treatment and your anti-jealousy amulet, thank you very much. One fragment contains a riddle. What holds knowledge but cannot speak? What travels time but has no feet? A book, obviously, but also you. You're sitting here, centuries later, reading the echoes of people who lived, loved, feared, cured, believed, and laughed. One scholar even penciled in a note at the bottom of a particularly dry theology manuscript, "Forgive the dryness." The author was fasting when he wrote this. You burst out laughing. The young librarian smiles. "He was my great, great, great uncle," he says. "Had a reputation for very sleepy theology. There's something sacred in this informality. In the way these manuscripts don't try to be eternal, they just are. They breathe. Some are barely held together. Others still smell faintly of the perfume their owners dabbed into the margins. One has a faint oil stain shaped suspiciously like a goat hoof. Life happened. Ink captured it. You leave the home library feeling a little unmoored. The idea that knowledge must be neatly categorized, stripped of emotion, scrubbed of magic that feels wrong now. In Timbuktu, wisdom was messy, overlapping, handwritten in the margins. As you walk back through the alleyways, you pass a child playing in the dirt, tracing letters in the sand with a stick. An older boy corrects him gently, showing the curve of a better, raw character. And just like that, you see it again. Learning in the open, passed between generations, out in the sun. Nothing locked in ivory towers, just ink, dust, and a stubborn refusal to forget. The manuscripts of Timbuktu weren't just about preserving what was, they're about honoring what could be. Even the ones with crocodile dung spells. Your sandals are wearing thin. Your brain feels like it's had a 3-course meal of philosophy, and yet you're still hungry. Because now you want to know how this happened. How did a city tucked deep in the Sahara, reachable only by camel caravan and sheer willpower, become one of the greatest centers of knowledge in the medieval world? Spoiler alert, it wasn't an accident. Let's rewind a few centuries. The story begins with trade. Always trade. Timbuktu was founded in the early 12th century, not as a city of scholars, but as a seasonal campsitea stopover for nomadic Tuareg herders who followed water and shade like breadcrumbs across the desert. The name itself, according to local legend, means the Well of Buktu, named after an old woman who guarded the water supply. So yes, the intellectual capital of medieval West Africa might have started with a grandmother in a bucket. You loved that for her. But as the caravans grew loaded with salt from the mines of Tagaza, gold from bambuk, cola nuts, ivory, and even enslaved people from neighboring regions, Timbuktu began to fatten with possibility. Its location near the Niger River made it the perfect crossroads between North African traders and the kingdoms of the Sahel. With trade came wealth. With wealth came architecture. And with architecture, libraries. By the 13th century, the city was absorbed into the Mali Empire, just in time for Mansa Musa to sprinkle his Midas touch. You remember him, the emperor, so loaded he tanked Cairo's economy during his pilgrimage to Mecca. But what many forget is that along his golden journey, he also gathered scholars, architects, and books like they were Pokemon. When he returned, he didn't just build mosques, he built institutions. One of those was the transformation of Sankore from a modest mosque into a full-blown university. He funded scholarships, imported teachers, and ensured the brightest minds had ink, paper, and maybe even a free lunch, though historians still argue whether students got falafel stipends. It's during this era that Timbuktu starts shimmering in records not just as a marketplace but as a mind place. And you start to see how intentional it all was. Education in Timbuktu wasn't a luxury, it was a system. Families invested in it the way others invest in land. Boys sometimes, girls Tower sent to study with sheikhs, often apprenticing for years before being allowed to touch a serious manuscript. Some studied under one teacher their whole lives. Others wandered like academic nomads, collecting ideas like seashells. What surprises you is how democratic the whole thing feels. Yes, scholars held immense respect, but you didn't have to be born noble to become one. If you had the mind, the discipline, and the stamina for all-night calligraphy sessions, you could rise. There were even report cards, not in grades, but in recommendations. A sheikh would write a brief note on your talent, trustworthiness, and general vibe. These were your tickets to future study or employment. One glowing report might open the door to a royal court. A bad one? Let's just say you'd better hope your camel likes long rides. And speaking of royal courts, you know Timbuktu had no king of its own during its scholarly peak? It was ruled externally, first by the Mali Empire, then the Songhai, then briefly the Moroccans. But internally, The city operated through a tight web of scholar elders, merchant families, and religious leaders. Think of it as a decentralized academic republic. Less Game of Thrones, more TED Talk Council. That may be why Timbuktu survived as long as it did. When armies swept through, the city bent but didn't break. Its lifeblood wasn't its wall sit, was its minds. Knowledge was too dispersed, too embedded in family homes, too deeply respected to be fully destroyed. You can burn a library, but good luck finding every copy in every pot, attic, and mosque cubbyhole. Still, there were threats, like the Moroccan invasion in 1591, which left Timbuktu bleeding. Scholars were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Manuscripts were seized. Students fled. Some say the university never fully recovered. Others claim that the knowledge simply went underground, hidden, whispered, memorized. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's intellectual tradition collapsed or just shifted gears. You're starting to suspect it did both. The city would eventually fade from the global map not because it failed, but because colonial narratives buried it. When European explorers arrived in the 19th century, they were underwhelmed. They expected marble palaces. What they found was mud brick. They expected Greek-style academies. What they found was old men in robes, reading by lamplight. So they dismissed it. One Frenchman even called it a city of illusion. But the illusion was his. He mistook silence for ignorance, dust for decay, and modesty for irrelevance. You exhale slowly as the wind picks up again. You're sitting now at the base of a crumbling wall once lined with shelves. The wood is gone. The knowledge is not. You can still feel it in the air like static, like incense, like a whisper through the stone. The genius of Timbuktu was never in its buildings. It was in its belief that knowledge belonged to the people, that ink was worth more than gold, that learning could happen anywhere: a mosque, a market, a shaded courtyard where a child repeats verses with dust on their knees. And in that belief, Timbuktu outlived the empires around it. There's something oddly soothing about wandering through a place where every stone seems to remember a quote, a verse, or a whispered debate. By now, you've walked through mosques, peeked into libraries, knelt beside scribes, and nearly choked on dust during a lecture on the lunar calendar. But you haven't yet climbed the oldest guardian of them all, Jingwereber, built in 1327 by architects brought from Andalusia's Spain across the sea of sand. This mud brick marvel is a mosque, a classroom, a monument, and, depending on who you ask, a bit of a miracle. You arrive just after the noon prayer, when the courtyard is mostly empty and the shadows have pooled cool and dark beneath the thick walls. Jingareber doesn't try to impress with height or polish. It whispers. Its minaret looks like a giant termite mound, in the best way covered in palmwood beams that jut out like handles, used by the community to climb and replaster the surface each year before the rains. 1,000 hands have kept it alive, patching sun-baked clay like stitches on a breathing giant. You step through the doorway, and immediately you're engulfed by the hush. Not silence, just deep quiet, the kind that hums in your bones. The walls are so thick they swallow the outside world. Inside, there's coolness, a gift in this furnace of a climate. Light filters in through small holes high on the wall, creating constellations of gold dust that drift lazily through the air like half-forgotten thoughts. A man kneels at the far end, reciting verses aloud, not loudly, just enough to keep the syllables alive. You don't interrupt. Instead, you move toward a carved wooden pulpit where, for centuries, scholars gave Friday sermons that doubled as academic lectures. Politics, law, theology, even health advice, sometimes all in one sitting. The people of Timbuktu weren't just listening for salvation. They were also waiting to hear whether the salt tax was changing again. You spot faint writing etched into the wall behind the pulpit. Someone, long ago, carved a single word: ilm, knowledge. Jingarabur is filled with that word, not printed, not painted, lived. You make your way through its labyrinthine inner chambers, used for teaching, storage, and the occasional scholar nap, honestly necessary. One room contains a wooden chest, sealed tight with brass latches and worn from years of reverent hands. It once held a copy of the Mukaddima, the great work of Ibn Khaldun, an early vision of sociology and historical cycles, copied here by candlelight while Europe still blamed comets for the plague. You touch the chest, and it's warm, not metaphorically, literally, because the desert has a way of reminding you it's still in charge. A guide joins you, an elderly caretaker, whose voice is soft but commands the kind of respect you can't fake. He tells you that during the Moroccan occupation, parts of the mosque were used to hide manuscripts. Under the floor, he says, pointing to a small square tile. And sometimes in the ceiling, you blink. They hid books in the roof? He nods. Books are safer than bodies, but you protect both. This line? Yeah, it'll follow you for the rest of your life. He leads you up a narrow staircase, steep, twisting, and clearly not designed for anyone over 5'6". You emerge blinking into the minaret tower, where the muezzin once climbed daily to call the faithful. The view nearly knocks you backward. All of Timbuktu lies below you. Flat roofs, minarets, courtyards, kids kicking up dust as they chase each other, traders unfurling cloth in the sun, and far in the distance, the golden shimmer of the desert preparing to roll in again like an ancient tide. Up here, you feel it. This was never just a city. It was a signal for a place that lit the sky with its thoughts. And somehow, it still does. You glance down and see a flock of birds circling low over a nearby building. The guide says it used to be a student dormitory. They used to recite the Quran all night, he says, and the birds would stay just to hear the rhythm. Okay, that's suspiciously poetic, but you're in Timbuktu. You don't question the poetry. You just let it happen. You descend from the tower slowly, fingers trailing the warm wall. Back on the ground, you're ushered into a side room where a few surviving fragments of old manuscripts are displayed. Not in cases, just laid gently on clean cloth. One is barely a palm's length long, edges frayed, script fading. A fragment from a poem about the soul's journey through time. You read the opening lines. Do not fear the winds, for even sand remembers the footprints of stars. Whoever wrote that, they understood Jingureber. You sit outside for a while, watching the light shift over the mosque's surface. It darkens and cools, taking on the color of deep chocolate, then slowly warming again as the sun plays peekaboo through the clouds. It's alive, this building, not metaphorically, like actually alive. Maintained, adapted, spoken to by every hand that's patched its cracks. And it's not just the scholars who keep it going. It's the kids who sweep the courtyards, the women who haul water for replastering, the craftsmen who pass down the recipe for mud like a family secret. Knowledge here isn't held by the elite. It's passed, shared, remembered in body as much as in book. One final note before you go. Jinguereber is one of the only buildings in Timbuktu that has never stopped functioning, despite wars, invasions, colonization, climate change, and the occasional smug French explorer. It's still standing, still teaching, still listening. You walk away in silence, because some places don't need a narrator. They already speak. There's a breeze tonight, a dry, whispering thing that coils around doorways and under robes like it's trying to remind you of something. You pull your shawl tighter and follow it, not quite sure where you're going, but your feet seem to know. They take you past the market, quieter now, through alleys that echo with ghost laughter and sandal slap, and into a part of the city you haven't explored yet. You're headed for the manuscript keepers, the modern descendants of Timbuktu's scribes, guardians of paper, dust, and memory. A wooden door swings open before you knock. The man standing there is wiry, wrapped in a sand-colored robe with a pen tucked behind one ear like an old habit he never gave up. He smiles, steps aside, and waves you in. This, he says simply, is the house of hidden books. Inside, it's dense, not cluttered, not messy, just alive. Manuscripts in every direction, stacked in neat towers, wrapped in cloth, tucked into clay shelves. One sits in a carved-out groove in the wall like a sleeping cat. The air is cool and dry, no glass cases, no climate control, just wisdom and walls, and maybe a faint trace of cardamom. You pause, looking around in awe. He notices and says, almost apologetically, "We don't show everything. Some texts don't like to be watched." And that's when you realize, in this world, books have personalities. You follow him into the main room, where several younger Archivistchi's sons, his niece, and a girl wearing a head wrap patterned with verses from a Quranic surah are busy sorting manuscripts, not alphabetically, not by subject, by mood.
"Yes," one of them says when you ask. "Some days the poems want to be together. Other times the maps need space." You nod slowly. You get it. Sort of. The keeper unwraps a bundle carefully. Inside is a slim volume, barely bound, its corners frayed from generations of turning. The script is sharp and elegant, and the pages smell faintly of age and mango wood. He gestures toward it. "This one," he says, "was buried for 40 years, in a basket, under a donkey stable." Your eyebrows shoot up. "To protect it?" He smiles. "From rain, from soldiers, from those who think truth can be owned." There's a long pause as you let that sink in, because it's not just metaphor. During times of upheaval, from the Moroccan invasion to French colonial rule to recent extremist threats, families hid their books wherever they could, under beds, inside false ceilings, in caves outside the city. Some even disguised manuscripts as cooking parchment or stuffed them into hollowed-out loaves of bread. Historians still argue whether these acts were coordinated or spontaneous. But the result? A vast, decentralized network of book guardians, quiet rebels armed with ink. The keeper moves to another bundle. This one is much older, wrapped in thick wool and bound with red twine. He unties it slowly, revealing a manuscript that is clearly not in Arabic. The script is strange, geometric, looping, with a rhythm unlike anything you've seen. "Berber," he says, "possibly Tifinagh, or an early blend." You frown. "I thought most manuscripts here were Arabic." "They are," he replies, "but Timbuktu was never just one voice." You sit with that for a moment, because he's right. Arabic may have been the scholarly lingua franca, but Timbuktu's intellectual garden had many roots. Local languages, oral traditions, African cosmologies, and regional dialects braided into the academic DNA. He opens the manuscript and points to a passage halfway down the page. This one describes the memory palace of a man who never forgot anything. He built stories into the walls of his mind, a camel in each corridor, a number in each hoofprint. You grin. It's like mental Hogwarts, but sandier. Then something even stranger happens. He pulls out a single loose page, wrapped in wax cloth and sealed with a red thread. The script is illegible, clearly written in code. "No one's cracked it," he says. "We think it's personal, a cipher between teacher and student, a secret between souls." You look around the room again. Dozens, maybe hundreds of these volumes live here, breathing quietly in the dry air. Some are incomplete, others water-stained or worm-nibbled, but none are dead. Everyone is active. They're not just archives. They're relationships. Before you leave, the keeper hands you a small paper square, folded neatly, sealed with wax, light as a dream. "A copy of a proverb," he explains, "to keep. Later, When you open it under moonlight, it reads, "The ink that knows it is seen will speak more clearly." Outside, the desert wind picks up. You hear a rooster crow early, or maybe late, and a baby fussing in the distance. The stars overhead are pinned to a sky so black it could swallow every city map you've ever known, and you realize something wild. You've walked among empires and kings, heard verses and riddles, touched books that crossed centuries, but the people who kept them safe, they never left. They're here, in every humble home with a hidden bookshelf, in every child writing their name in sand, in every whispered joke between pages. Timbuktu didn't vanish. It hid, patiently, purposefully, like a lion waiting in the tall grass of time. And now slowly it's uncurling its stories again.
Yes, one of them says when you ask. Some days, the poems want to be together. Other times, the maps need space. You nod slowly. You get it. Sort of. The keeper unwraps a bundle carefully. Inside is a slim volume, barely bound, its corners frayed from generations of turning. The script is sharp and elegant, and the pages smell faintly of age and mango wood. He gestures toward it. This one, he says, was buried for 40 years in a basket under a donkey stable. Your eyebrows shoot up. To protect it, he smiles. From rain, from soldiers, from those who think truth can be owned. There's a long pause as you let that sink in, because it's not just metaphor. During times of upheaval, from the Moroccan invasion to French colonial rule to recent extremist threats, families hid their books wherever they could, under beds, inside false ceilings, in caves outside the city. Some even disguised manuscripts as cooking parchment or stuffed them into hollowed-out loaves of bread. Historians still argue whether these acts were coordinated or spontaneous. But the result? A vast, decentralized network of book guardians, quiet rebels armed with ink. The keeper moves to another bundle. This one is much older, wrapped in thick wool and bound with red twine. He unties it slowly, revealing a manuscript that is clearly not in Arabic. The script is strange, geometric, looping, with a rhythm unlike anything you've seen. Berber, he says, possibly Tifina, or an early blend. You frown. I thought most manuscripts here were Arabic. They are, he replies. But Timbuktu was never just one voice. You sit with that for a moment, because he's right. Arabic may have been the scholarly lingua franca, but Timbuktu's intellectual garden had many roots. Local languages, oral traditions, African cosmologies, and regional dialects braided into the academic DNA. He opens the manuscript and points to a passage halfway down the page. This one describes the memory palace of a man who never forgot anything. He built stories into the walls of his mind, a camel in each corridor, a number in each hoof print. You grin. It's like mental Hogwarts, but sandier. Then something even stranger happens. He pulls out a single loose page, wrapped in wax cloth and sealed with a red thread. The script is illegible, clearly written in code. No one's cracked it, he says. We think it's personal, a cipher between teacher and student, a secret between souls. You look around the room again. Dozens, maybe hundreds of these volumes live here, breathing quietly in the dry air. Some are incomplete, others water-stained or worm-nibbled, but none are dead. Every one is active. They're not just archives, they're relationships. Before you leave, the keeper hands you a small paper square, folded neatly, sealed with wax, light as a dream. A copy of a proverb, he explains, to keep. Later, when you open it under moonlight, it reads, "The ink that knows it is seen will speak more clearly." Outside, the desert wind picks up. You hear a rooster crow early, or maybe late, and a baby fussing in the distance. The stars overhead are pinned to a sky so black it could swallow every city map you've ever known. And you realize something wild. You've walked among empires and kings, heard verses and riddles, touched books that crossed centuries. But the people who kept them safe, they never left. They're here, in every humble home with a hidden bookshelf, in every child writing their name in sand, in every whispered joke between pages. Timbuktu didn't vanish, it hid, patiently, purposefully, like a lion waiting in the tall grass of time. And now, slowly, it's uncurling its stories again. You wake to birdsong and the sound of a broom sweeping sand from a doorstep. The city is alive again, yawning into another sun-bleached day. But your thoughts are still tangled in ink and parchment, in those soft, steady hands that unfolded secrets by firelight. You've seen the scribes. You've met the guardians. Now, it's time to follow the manuscripts beyond Timbuktu's walls, to understand how these dusty treasures survived everything the world threw at them. So you follow the trail. It begins on the back of a donkey cart. The scene is surreal. The year? Not 1400, not 1600. Try 2012. The cargo? Hundreds of fragile manuscripts packed in chests, baskets, and rice sacks. The mission? Escape. As extremist militants descended on Timbuktu, burning shrines, enforcing bans on music, and threatening to destroy centuries of culture, ordinary citizens became smugglers, book smugglers. You step into this memory as though stepping into a hidden alley, lit only by adrenaline and the crackling fear of being found. A man named Abdel Kader Haidara, a modern-day librarian and descendant of one of Timbuktu's great scholarly families, organizes the escape. His team doesn't wear capes. They wear flip-flops, dusty shirts, and expressions that say, "No, you cannot have our history." They move the manuscripts at night, often under armed escort, sometimes in canoes, paddling silently down the Niger, sometimes overland by camel or truck, through checkpoints and dunes. Each journey is a gamble. Every page smuggled is a defiance. You meet one of these guardians, a wiry man with a laugh that could split stone in the hands of someone who's carried both books and babies through peril. He shows you one of the boxes they used. Handmade wood, lined with cotton, sealed with wax. Inside, a Quran commentary from the 1500s, wrapped in layers of indigo cloth, and a child's t-shirt that says, "I soccer, yeah, let that one settle." Because this wasn't just preservation, it was protection. These manuscripts were not artifacts to be admired. They were relatives, ancestors, family. You don't leave your grandmother in a burning house. You carry her. Historians still argue whether the scale of this rescue mission has been exaggerated in media retellings, or whether the romance of it overshadows the scholarly content of the texts. But no one argues the bravery. No one questions the impact. In a time of fire and fear, knowledge was moved, not out of museums, but through kitchens, over fences, under cloaks. One woman tells you she hid manuscripts in a baby crib, laying her sleeping son across them. Another, a teenage boy, buried pages beneath the chicken coop. The chickens, you're told, were very protective, pecked at anyone who came too close. Heroes, those hens. Today, many of these rescued manuscripts are stored in secret or scattered across Bamako, Mali's capital. Others have been digitized, slowly, carefully, with scanners that whine like lazy mosquitoes and hands that tremble with reverence. The work is far from done. You visit one such archive. It's makeshift. White walls, humming fans, cables taped to floors. But it feels like a command center for cultural survival. Technicians hover over old texts like surgeons, scanning every page, photographing every smudge and ink blotch. One leans in and whispers, "Sometimes the fingerprints are still visible." From 400 years ago, you exhale, because in that moment, history isn't a distant blur. It's touchable. Another archivist shows you a screen displaying a page written in Arabic script, but with marginal notes in Songhai. Translation, she says. It's a letter from a merchant advising his cousin on how to avoid being scammed in salt deals. Practical, timeless. You'd share it on Instagram today with the caption, "How not to get ripped off at the market, circa 1472. But it's not just the content. It's the choice to remember. Because here's the hard truth. Timbuktu's manuscripts aren't safe yet. Climate change threatens the mud brick walls that protect them. Insects, mold, neglect. They all nibble at the edges. And funding? Always a struggle. Even now, many of these texts are guarded not by technology, but by tradition. Families who whisper their histories forward and pray the next generation listens. Some are. You meet a teenager named Miriam, who's helping rebind manuscripts using traditional methods. Rawhide, acacia glue, hand-woven string. My grandmother taught me, she says. She said the books feel pain if you bind them too tight. You nod, because by now, you absolutely believe books have feelings. You ask her what she wants to do when she grows up. Tell stories, she says. The old ones. The ones with monsters and moon maps. But also the ones with real heroes. Like Haidara. Like my grandmother. Outside, the sun is dipping low, turning the city gold again. You realize you've been here for days now, maybe weeks, in story time. Time has bent, folded like a well-read page, and all around you, people are still fighting, not with swords, but with scanners, calligraphy, and compostable storage solutions. You pass by a cafe where an old man is reciting poetry over tea. Kids giggle nearby, tracing letters in the dirt with straws. A woman gently dusts the spine of a book on a home shelf, then kisses it once before setting it back down. You realize something wild. Timbuktu isn't just in Mali. It's in every act of remembering, in every whispered line passed from grandmother to grandchild, in every student who copies a verse with care, in every box of books hidden beneath a floorboard, in every scholar who says, "No, this story isn't lost. It's just waiting." The manuscripts survive not because of magic, but because of love. Dusty, stubborn, handwritten love. You've seen the pages. You've felt the weight of them in your hands, in your chest, maybe even in your dreams. But now, it's time to answer a question that's been scratching quietly at the back of your mind, like a polite but persistent goat. What was actually inside all those manuscripts? Sure, you've heard hints. Astronomy, poetry, salt tax warnings. But tonight, you crack the vault wide open. You sit cross-legged on a cool clay floor, surrounded by scholars who've spent decades decoding, translating, and sometimes just staring at manuscripts until they decide to reveal a sentence or two. Because remember, some of these texts were written in metaphor, or in abbreviations, or in half Arabic, half local slang that no app is ever going to translate for you, ever. But with patience, the layers start to peel back. First up, astronomy. You open a thick volume, pages stiff with age, and find an entire star chart inked in lapis blue. It doesn't just list constellations, it tells stories about them. A line connecting Orion's belt to a camel caravan. Notes about when to plant sorghum based on the rising of a particular star. One page has a diagram of a solar eclipse that looks like a cookie with a bite taken out. Cute and slightly terrifying. Here's the wild part. These scholars weren't just copying Greek or Islamic astronomy. They were observing the sky themselves, cross-referencing with oral traditions, and building a new understanding that fit the West African environment. One manuscript even documents a theory about the moon's influence on childbirth. Historians still argue whether that counts as proto-gynecology or just poetic lunar obsession. Either way, someone was watching the sky a lot. Next, medicine. You flip open a thinner book. The edges darkened like it once spent time too close to a cooking fire. Inside, lists of herbs, preparation methods, and vivid warnings like, "Do not harvest this root on a day of heavy wind, or the spirit of the plant will flee." Honestly, fair. The treatments range from logical, clove and honey for sore throat, to the folkloric, burned porcupine quill ash to cure excessive dreaming. You pause at a passage detailing a remedy for fever that climbs the bones. The prescription? A brew made from 7 leaves, the breath of a wise woman, and the shadow of a drum. Quirky. Maybe. But it worked for someone. Somewhere. And that matters. One manuscript, more fragile than the others, lists birthing techniques alongside prayers for safe delivery. Midwives would memorize entire chants, timed to each contraction. You imagine a candlelit hut, a nervous father outside, and inside, the sound of ancient words calming the air like wind through reeds. No Wi-Fi, just centuries of whispered wisdom. Your guide, an elderly woman with the hands of a potter and the eyes of someone who knows every answer but won't tell you unless you ask nicely, leans in to show you her favorite. A manuscript that blends botany with music theory. Wait, what? Yes, she says, grinning. Each plant has a sound. Each healing has a rhythm. She taps the page. This one, she says, was sung. And sure enough, you see notes scrawled in the margins. Part tonal scale, part melody line, part recipe. Imagine trying to brew a tea and hit the right pitch while doing it. You'd better hope you're not tone deaf. You move on to mathematics, not the kind you hated in school. This is math that means something. Geometry used to calculate irrigation layouts for desert farming, ratios for camel loads, tax calculations that make it clear someone was definitely scamming someone else. There's one entire text devoted to magic squares, grids where every row, column, and diagonal adds up to the same number. But they're not just math puzzles. In Timbuktu, they doubled as talismans. You see diagrams where the numbers are inscribed into amulets, supposedly to protect the wearer from snakebite, heartbreak, or corrupt tax collectors. Sometimes all 3 at once. One manuscript even includes a proof involving the spiritual weight of numbers, arguing that the number 19 holds cosmic balance and should never be used to calculate livestock sales. Bad energy, it warns in the margin. You nod solemnly. No cursed cows. Thank you very much. Then there's the philosophy. Oh boy, these texts are dense. You open one and immediately feel like your brain just stubbed its toe. There are arguments about the nature of justice, about the obligations of rulers, about whether it's more ethical to punish ignorance or reward curiosity. Some texts are adaptations of classical Islamic scholars like Al-Farabi and Averroes. Others, completely local, written by West African thinkers who never traveled to Baghdad or Cairo, but who somehow still managed to hold their own in debates about moral relativism. You pause at one marginal scribble, probably a student note, that reads, "He talks too much." But he might be right. Every school has that student. You ask your guide what her favorite manuscript is. She smiles and brings out a small cloth-wrapped book with a cracked leather cover. Inside, proverbs, dozens of them, some practical, some poetic, some just weird. Salt does not envy the sugar because it knows its purpose. Rain does not ask permission from the sand. If the goat smiles, check your shoes. You will think about that goat one at 3 a.m. Guaranteed. You sit with those proverbs for a while, letting them drip into your brain like warm honey. And then you realize something. None of these texts were created in isolation. They were written in community, read aloud, argued over, annotated, passed down, copied again, reinterpreted. These weren't just books. They were conversations across generations. Historians still argue whether the majority of Timbuktu's texts were purely academic or interwoven with daily survival. But standing here now, surrounded by texts about healing, dreaming, measuring, planting, and loving, you suspect the answer is both, because the manuscripts didn't try to separate science from story, fact from faith, or poetry from practicality. They were all the same thing. Tools for living. And honestly, that might be the most advanced knowledge system of all. You're deep in it now. Your fingertips still tingle from that proverb book. Your thoughts still hum with the echo of star maps and healing chants. But there's one more chapter to unroll in this scroll of a city. One thread that weaves everything together and reminds you why Timbuktu's manuscripts are so hauntingly powerful. The scribes. You head toward a quiet quarter at the edge of the city, where the alleyways narrow and the walls lean in like old friends. Here, past a crooked door, painted with a faded crescent moon, lives one of the last traditional calligraphers. His name is Salim. He's maybe 70, maybe 100. It's hard to tell. He has an ink stain on his thumb that looks suspiciously permanent. When he smiles, it feels like sunrise. He doesn't greet you with words. Instead, he hands you a blank sheet of handmade paper, fibrous, uneven, delicately speckled, and gestures to sit. This, he finally says, is where time begins. And then he begins to write. You've seen calligraphy before, but this isn't just writing. It's choreography. His wrist barely moves. His fingers dance in a kind of trance. The ink flows like it's been waiting for this page since the first camel caravan set out for Gao. You watch in silence, hypnotized, as each letter curves and curls with impossible precision. He's not copying a text. He's composing something new, something personal. A poem, maybe. A prayer. Or both. In Timbuktu, those often blurred together. You ask him how long he's been doing this. Since I could sit still, he says. And I wasn't good at that. His teacher was his uncle. His uncle's teacher was a wandering scholar from Jenne. And that scholar, nobody remembers. But his handwriting lives on in the margins of a 400-year-old manuscript still stored 2 houses down. This is how it worked. Scribes were trained young, not just in penmanship, but in patience, in watching. They learned the weight of ink, the texture of vellum, the silence between syllables. It wasn't about speed. It was about listening to the words before writing them. Salim shows you his tools: reed pens, blades for trimming, natural ink made from gum arabic, charcoal, sometimes crushed seeds or flowers for pigment. He has a small jar of saffron ink that he only uses for chapter titles and very special curses. He chuckles when he says that. You believe him. He lets you try, handing over a thin reed. You dip it into a well of ink so dark it looks like melted obsidian. Your hand trembles. Your first letter. Well, let's just say it's abstract art. Salim pats your shoulder. The paper forgives, he says. That's good, because you nearly flick ink onto his robe. As you fumble, he begins to talk. Not lecture, just talk. About how scribes in Timbuktu weren't just secretaries. They were editors, teachers, philosophers. Some even added little notes in the margins when they disagreed with what they were copying. One manuscript famously contains a scathing comment. This author speaks with great confidence, but little clarity. Basically, medieval shade. Salim tells you about his grandfather, who used to teach 3 students at once, one for copying, one for ink making, one for recitation. They worked in rotation. When one got tired, they'd all switch tasks. That way, he says, your eyes never get bored. You wonder how many of those books, now stored in dusty corners, were built like this, by teams of quiet minds in sunlit rooms, laughing, muttering, spilling ink, debating grammar for hours. You imagine a manuscript being born, slowly, over weeks or months. Every blot a fingerprint, every margin note a sigh from a tired student or a stubborn teacher. Historians still argue whether scribes saw themselves as artists or laborers, whether they were paid well or merely tolerated. But Salim shrugs when you ask. We were needed, he says. That was enough. In Timbuktu, scribes were like bakers or blacksmiths, essential, respected, but not worshipped. No ivory towers, just a slow, sacred craft passed from hand to hand. He opens a trunk and shows you a ledger. Nothing glamorous, just a record of copies made. Each line lists a title, a date, and sometimes a tiny note. Ink poor today, pages smudged. Or scribe fasting, lines uneven. Human, so achingly human. Then he shows you his most prized possession, a manuscript in progress. The pages are blank except for a title, Reflections Before Rain. He's been writing it for 15 years. It's not for anyone else, he says. It's just what I think when the clouds come. You want to ask to read it, but you don't. Some things are better left wrapped in silence and saffron. Before you leave, he gives you a reed pen. Try again. says, but only when you're tired enough to write slow. Outside, the sun has dipped behind the mosque. The call to prayer floats through the city like smoke. You look down at the pen in your hand and realize you're holding a time machine, not one that zooms, one that waits. As you walk back through the city, every doorway seems more alive. Every flicker of lamplight feels like a verse waiting to be written. And somewhere, you're sure of it, another scribe is dipping their pen and whispering to the page, "You're going to outlive me, aren't you?" And the page, it probably smiles. You know what no one tells you about a city built on knowledge. It's messy, not the streets. Those are tidy enough, swept clean each morning with palm frond brooms and quiet pride. No, the ideas are messy. Conflicting texts, scribbled corrections, footnotes that wander off mid-sentence, two manuscripts claiming completely different dates for the same eclipse, each one swearing it's the truth. And this is where we go next. The contradictions, the gaps, the beautiful chaos that lives between the lines of Timbuktu's legacy. Because if you're imagining a grand, unified library system with catalog cards and decimal numbers, let's slow that camel down. Timbuktu's manuscripts were never collected into one vast library. They were scattered across private homes, family collections, small mosques, courtyards, and in some cases, literal pots. Yes, clay pots. You come across one such pot, still intact, hidden beneath a family's storage room floor. It contains 3 brittle manuscripts wrapped in goatskin and the remnants of dried mint. Protection, preservation, pest control. Historians still argue whether that was intentional or just someone's grocery bag in the 1700s. The truth is, Timbuktu was more of a knowledge ecosystem than a single institution. Like a rainforest, its strength was in biodiversity. Ideas grew in unexpected corners. A merchant might own a Quranic commentary and a farming almanac. A leatherworker might pass down a poem about migration. A scholar's teenage daughter might scribble notes in the margin of a legal text, then become a teacher herself. So when outsiders arrived looking for the great library, they missed it because they were standing inside it. And that's where the contradictions begin. You sit in on a debate among local scholars. 2 elders, a university student, and a radio host who's apparently famous for once reading a love poem on air that caused 3 marriage proposals and 1 community-wide blushing incident. They're arguing about the origins of a certain medical text. The older scholar says it came from Egypt. The student insists it was written locally by a mystic named Mbare. The radio host just wants to know whether the root mentioned on page 5 actually helps with heartbreak. Spoiler, no one agrees, and no one needs to, because disagreement here is a kind of respect. It means you're engaged, alive in the story. A page is never just read, it's interpreted, rewritten, reinvented, which brings us to forgery. Oh yes, Timbuktu had those too. One particularly famous manuscript, long assumed to be a Songhai-era political treatise, was recently revealed to be, let's say, creatively edited. The original was a list of property boundaries. The updated version added philosophical arguments about the divine right of rulers and some very flattering notes about a particular emir's beard. Historians still argue whether this was propaganda or just a bored scribe getting spicy with his source material. You decide to believe it was both. The beard was impressive, but the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. Timbuktu's manuscripts weren't static truths. They were living dialogues. A scholar might copy a manuscript and add new footnotes, some reverent, some skeptical. A teacher might tell students to skip certain lines. A family might preserve one version of a text while quietly letting another one fade away. Nothing was fixed. Even names shifted. You find at least 3 spellings for Sankore, depending on the century inscribed. Sometimes it's Sankara, sometimes just the big place. You love that. It's like Timbuktu is politely reminding you that humans are gloriously inconsistent, and yet, in that inconsistency, a pattern forms. The manuscripts may not agree on dates or names, but they agree on values. Learning is sacred. Ideas should be shared. Knowledge must travel, whether on camelback, in the mouth of a griot, or tucked into the folds of a grandmother's shawl. You walk through the home of a manuscript collector who has texts from 5 different regions. She shows you one that's clearly Moroccan in style, another with Hausa proverbs woven into its margin, and a third that was copied by someone whose notes are all in, wait for it, Old Spanish. What is this doing here, you ask? She shrugs. It got lost, or found, or traded, or smuggled. Who knows? Because that's Timbuktu, a place where ideas arrived, mingled, fell in love, argued about lunar eclipses, and left fingerprints on each other before moving on. Sometimes, quite literally, you stumble on a page with overlapping marginalia. 3 generations of handwriting in 3 colors of ink, each responding to the same line of text. It's like a centuries-long group chat. One note corrects a mathematical error. Another challenges the first correction. The third simply says, "Both of you missed the point. Timbuktu doesn't just preserve knowledge. It preserves process. It reminds you that facts are built slowly, collectively, like a pot made from many hands. And yes, sometimes someone accidentally steps on the pot. But even that becomes part of the story. By the time you leave the room, your mind is full of questions. But for once, that feels like the goal. Timbuktu never wanted you to have all the answers. It just wanted you to start asking better ones. Night falls again, soft as velvet, over the rooftops of Timbuktu. But your brain, wide awake, buzzing, overflowing with ideas that feel older than time and somehow freshly minted just for you. You've wandered alleys and archives, met scribes and smuggled verses, and still, you're turning over one final question like a coin in your hand. How did it all fall apart? Because let's be honest, Timbuktu is no longer the global capital of knowledge it once was. The glory faded, the scribes dwindled, the walls crumbled, and while the manuscripts remain, scattered and tenacious, the golden age ended long before your bedtime story began. So, what happened? Let's rewind. It wasn't one thing. It never is. Start with empire fatigue. By the late 1500s, the Songhai Empire, the scholarly scaffolding that held Timbuktu together, was already cracking under its own weight. Political instability, dynastic squabbles, and regional rebellions chipped away at its power. Then, in 1591, Morocco invaded. Not with ideas, but with guns. You feel the shift, like a cold wind through your bones. Imagine scholars scattering, scribes hiding their quills, Moroccan soldiers trudging through Sankore, not to learn, but to occupy. Some manuscripts were seized, others hidden. The rhythm of learning broke, not all at once, but like a drum slowly going out of tune. Still, Timbuktu persisted, even in the face of colonialism. In the 1800s, the French swept into West Africa, eager to redraw maps and civilize what they didn't understand. Timbuktu became a military outpost, not a scholarly beacon. Mosques were repurposed, schools restricted. French officials often dismissed the local culture as backwards, while literally standing atop manuscripts that contained more recorded history than most European libraries of the time. One colonial officer famously wrote, "I found nothing of interest here," which is a take. You walk past the old colonial fort, now turned into a modest museum. Inside, one wall lists the names of explorers who discovered Timbuktu, often years after it had already been mapped by local scholars, sung by griots, and explained in legal texts passed from mother to daughter. Historians still argue whether colonial neglect or active destruction caused more damage to the city's heritage. But either way, by the early 1900s, Timbuktu's global voice had been muffled, not silenced, just tuned out. And then came modernity. Roads replaced caravans. Radio replaced griots. Kids grew up learning French instead of Arabic. The great scholarly lineages fractured. Many families couldn't afford to keep the manuscripts safe. Others didn't know what they had. Manuscripts ended up in basements, sheds, or sold at markets to tourists who thought they were just old papers. Some were burned. Some were chewed by goats. Some simply disappeared. You find one such basement, musty, damp, a forgotten corner of a once grand house. There's a stack of papers tied with fraying string. The script is faint, the edges curled. A family member explains they were used as fire starters, back when the lights went out too often. You don't judge. How could you? In a world where survival trumps symbolism, even wisdom burns. But Timbuktu wasn't done, because just when you think the story ends, it turns. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, something began to stir. A new generation of Malians, historians, librarians, and families realized what was slipping through their fingers. Quiet revolutions began. Private collections opened. Scribes trained apprentices. International aid arrived. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. Digitization projects bloomed. Suddenly, the world wanted to listen again, and then, in 2012, it almost ended again. Armed extremists swept through northern Mali. Shrines were destroyed. Music was banned. Books were burned. But remember that donkey cart? That child's soccer shirt wrapped around a 16th century Quran? That was Timbuktu, refusing to vanish. You speak to a teenager who helped in the rescue efforts. He tells you he carried a trunk for miles, barefoot, through thorn scrub. I didn't know what was in it, he says. I just knew it was important. He's never read Arabic, but he still calls the manuscript my elder. That's the magic. Timbuktu doesn't require everyone to read the books. It just asks that you respect them, guard them, pass them on. Even now, the fight continues. Climate change threatens the adobe walls. Funding dries up. Tourists hesitate. And yes, extremist groups still loom at the edges of the Sahara like vultures in waiting, but the manuscripts are still here. You see them in plastic bins labeled in 3 languages. You see them in digital scans blinking across servers in Europe and Mali. You see them in classrooms where kids read proverbs out loud before math class. You see them in the quiet hands of an old man, wiping dust from a cover he copied 50 years ago. You see them in yourself, because maybe, just maybe, you're part of the story now. One more node in the long, unbroken chain of curious, stubborn humans who believe that stories matter. That knowledge is sacred. That sometimes, when the world feels like it's falling apart, the answer is to sit down, light a candle, and read. And if that candle's a little wobbly, light it anyway. You're back in the square where it all began. The sun is just a gold smear on the horizon. The minaret of Sankore casting its long shadow over cobblestones worn by 1,000 years of footsteps, sandals, and maybe the occasional goat chase. The air is warm and slow, and you can almost hear the city breathing again. There's a kid playing nearby, tracing shapes in the dust with a stick. You pause to watch. He's writing. Not words, just little spirals, stars, squiggles. But every so often, he glances up at the mosque, as if checking that the walls are still listening. And maybe they are. Because this city, this bundle of contradictions and whispers, is not just a place on a map. It's a memory palace with real walls. A living archive built from mud, ink, breath, and centuries of stubborn hope. You walk a little farther, past doorways, where scholars once taught under the open sky, past courtyards where manuscripts were aired in the sun like laundry, past wells where water once shimmered beside philosophy debates, and then you hear it, a low chant, maybe a prayer, maybe poetry. It drifts through a half-open window and coats your brain like warm tea. You lean in. You can't understand the words, but you feel them. They're old, gentle. They've been said 1,000 times, and yet, tonight, they're just for you. Inside that room, a family is reading aloud from a manuscript. No fancy podium, no velvet ropes, just a lamp, a mat, and a text older than anyone in the house. And here's the beautiful thing. This isn't a museum moment. It's just Tuesday. Timbuktu doesn't need tourists to validate it. It doesn't need international headlines. It doesn't need to prove it was once great, because it still is. Not loud, not showy, but resilient in the quietest way possible. Like a lantern flickering in a storm, too stubborn to blow out. You sit beside a vendor roasting peanuts. She hands you a handful without asking. Long day? She says. You nod. You look like someone who's heard too many stories. You laugh. Not enough, actually. She nods, as if that's the only right answer. Then she gestures toward the horizon. Out there, she says, are more cities like this. Not as famous, but full of books, full of dust, full of dreams. You believe her, because by now you understand. Timbuktu was never alone. It was part of a whole constellation of knowledge, a network of cities across the Sahel and Sahara, Jenne, Gao, Agadez, Kano, all trading not just goods, but ideas. The desert wasn't a barrier. It was a bridge. Historians still argue whether this network was truly global or just regional. But from where you're sitting, munching roasted peanuts and trying not to cry from beauty fatigue, it doesn't matter, because someone, hundreds of years ago, wrote a poem in the sand and trusted it would survive. Someone else memorized a recipe, recited it to a student, and that student whispered it to their child during a thunderstorm. A girl copied a passage about the stars onto a scrap of cloth, tucked it in her sleeve, and watched the moon rise like a slow secret. And now, you're here. You've walked their streets, touched their ink, laughed at their margin jokes, wondered at their wisdom, protected for a little while their story. The manuscripts are still hidden in clay shelves and carved boxes, still guarded by families who don't call themselves heroes, still speaking in soft syllables, the kinds of truths that don't need footnotes. You think back to that first door you walked through. The keeper who said, "Some texts don't like to be watched, but maybe, just maybe, they like to be remembered." You take out your reed pen. the one Salim gave you, and scribble a small note on the inside of your palm. Timbuktu lives, and it does, even if every page were burned, every wall eroded, every map redrawn. Timbuktu would survive in the stories. The dusty, imperfect, radiant stories. The ones we carry. The ones we tell. And you're a carrier now. Now take a deep breath. Let the desert air settle. Let the cities whisper, soften in your ears. You're no longer walking Timbuktu's alleys. You're lying still, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by quiet. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear the turn of a page, the scratch of a pen, the murmur of a poem drifting up through time. Slow your breath. Let the flickering lanterns of knowledge dim, one by one. The ink dries. The dust settles. The scribes rest their hands. The manuscripts sleep, folded into the walls of houses, tucked into chests, held in memory. They're not lost. They're just waiting. Waiting for morning, for curiosity, for someone to ask softly what came before. And now you do know. You've wandered a city that never truly left, through a story older than empires and gentler than sand. A story of stubborn beauty, of dusty wisdom, of pages that hum with breath. The stars are overhead now, pinned into a sky so deep you could fall into it. Let them watch over you, as they once watched over caravans and scribes and scholars walking home with ink-stained fingers. You're safe. The story is safe. Good night.